The inner critic is a voice that lives within each of us, often emerging in moments of self-doubt, fear, or vulnerability. It is the voice that tells us we are not good enough, smart enough, or capable enough to achieve our goals or live up to our potential. This internal dialogue can be relentless, and if left unchecked, it can have a profound impact on our mental well-being, self-esteem, and overall sense of happiness. Silencing the inner critic is not about denying our imperfections or avoiding constructive self-reflection. Rather, it is about quieting the harsh, often irrational judgments that hold us back from embracing our true selves and living a fulfilling life. The process of quieting this voice requires self-awareness, self-compassion, and the development of new, empowering thought patterns. The inner critic typically stems from early experiences in life, where we may have internalized negative messages from parents, teachers, peers, or society at large. These messages could have been subtle, like a passing comment about our abilities, or more overt, such as being constantly compared to others or criticized for not meeting certain expectations. Over time, these external criticisms become internalized, and we begin to adopt these negative beliefs as part of our self-concept. As a result, the inner critic becomes a powerful force that influences how we see ourselves and how we approach challenges in life. One of the most insidious aspects of the inner critic is that it often masquerades as a form of self-protection. It convinces us that by being hypercritical of ourselves, we can avoid making mistakes, experiencing failure, or facing rejection. The inner critic may say things like, "You're not talented enough to pursue that career," or "You'll embarrass yourself if you try." On the surface, these messages may seem like attempts to keep us safe from disappointment or failure. However, the reality is that the inner critic often prevents us from taking risks, trying new things, or stepping outside of our comfort zone, actions that are essential for growth, learning, and self-fulfillment. To silence the inner critic, the first and most important step is developing self-awareness. The more we understand the role that the inner critic plays in our lives, the better equipped we are to challenge its influence. This begins with recognizing when the inner critic is speaking. Often, its voice is so ingrained in our thought processes that we may not even realize it is there. We may take its negative messages at face value, assuming that they are accurate reflections of who we are. By practicing mindfulness and paying attention to our internal dialogue, we can start to identify when the inner critic is active. This awareness creates the space for us to question and challenge its validity. Once we become aware of the inner critic, the next step is to challenge its messages. The inner critic often operates based on distorted thinking patterns, such as catastrophizing, overgeneralizing, or all-or-nothing thinking. For example, if we make a mistake at work, the inner critic might say, "You're terrible at your job," rather than acknowledging that everyone makes mistakes and that one error does not define our abilities. By identifying these cognitive distortions, we can begin to reframe our thoughts in a more balanced and realistic way. Instead of accepting the inner critic's harsh judgments, we can ask ourselves, is this thought really true, or what evidence do I have that contradicts this belief? This process of questioning helps to weaken the inner critic's hold over us and opens the door to more constructive and empowering ways of thinking. Another powerful tool for silencing the inner critic is cultivating self-compassion. Self-compassion involves treating ourselves with the same kindness, understanding, and patience that we would offer to a close friend who is struggling. When the inner critic is active, it tends to be harsh, punitive, and unforgiving. It focuses on our perceived flaws and shortcomings, often magnifying them out of proportion. Self-compassion, on the other hand, encourages us to be gentle with ourselves, recognizing that we are human and that making mistakes or encountering setbacks is a natural part of life. Instead of berating ourselves for not being perfect, self-compassion helps us to acknowledge our imperfections with acceptance and grace. Practicing self-compassion can be transformative in quieting the inner critic because it shifts the way we relate to ourselves. Rather than seeing our mistakes as personal failures, we begin to view them as opportunities for growth and learning. Instead of internalizing negative feedback as a reflection of our worth, we learn to separate our actions from our identity. This shift in perspective helps to reduce the power of the inner critic, making it easier to move forward with resilience and confidence. One effective way to cultivate self-compassion is through self-talk. When the inner critic is active, we can consciously choose to respond with compassionate and supportive language. For example, if the inner critic says, "You're not good enough," we can counter this message by saying, "I'm doing the best I can, and that's enough." If the inner critic says, "You'll never succeed," we can respond with, "Success takes time and effort, and I'm capable of achieving my goals." By consistently practicing self-compassionate self-talk, we begin to rewire our thought patterns, replacing the inner critic's negative messages with more positive and affirming ones. It is also important to recognize that silencing the inner critic is not about silencing all forms of self-reflection or self-improvement. Constructive self-reflection is essential for growth, as it allows us to evaluate our actions, learn from our experiences, and make positive changes. However, constructive self-reflection is different from the inner critic in that it is objective, balanced, and focused on solutions rather than blame. For example, constructive self-reflection might say, "I made a mistake in that situation, but I can learn from it and do better next time," rather than, "I'm a failure because I made a mistake." By distinguishing between the inner critic and constructive self-reflection, we can continue to learn and grow without being weighed down by unnecessary self-judgment. This distinction also helps us to approach challenges with a growth mindset, the belief that our abilities and intelligence can be developed through effort and perseverance. When we adopt a growth mindset, we see setbacks not as evidence of our inadequacy, but as opportunities to improve and evolve. This mindset is incompatible with the inner critic, which thrives on fixed and limiting beliefs about ourselves. Another key aspect of silencing the inner critic is surrounding ourselves with supportive and positive influences. The people we interact with can have a significant impact on how we perceive ourselves. If we are constantly surrounded by individuals who are critical, judgmental, or unsupportive, it can reinforce the messages of the inner critic. On the other hand, being around people who are encouraging, understanding, and compassionate can help to counter the inner critic's narrative. These positive relationships provide a mirror in which we can see ourselves more clearly, free from the distortions of self-criticism. They remind us that we are worthy of love, respect, and kindness, both from others and from ourselves. In addition to seeking out supportive relationships, it can be helpful to engage in activities that promote self-expression and self-discovery. Creative outlets such as writing, painting, music, or dance provide opportunities to explore our inner world and express our thoughts and emotions in a way that is free from judgment. These activities allow us to connect with our authentic selves and to experience a sense of flow, where we are fully immersed in the present moment. When we engage in creative expression, the inner critic often takes a back seat, as we become more focused on the process of creation rather than the outcome or judgment. This can be incredibly liberating and can serve as a powerful tool for silencing the inner critic's voice. Finally, it is important to recognize that silencing the inner critic is not a one-time event but an ongoing practice. The inner critic may never fully disappear, but with time and effort, we can learn to manage its influence and prevent it from controlling our thoughts and actions. Like any habit, the more we practice self-awareness, self-compassion, and positive self-talk, the easier it becomes to quiet the inner critic. Over time, we develop a more balanced and compassionate relationship with ourselves, one that allows us to navigate life's challenges with greater resilience and confidence. Silencing the inner critic is an essential step toward living a more fulfilling and authentic life. It requires self-awareness, the ability to challenge negative thought patterns, and the cultivation of self-compassion. By developing a kinder, more supportive inner dialogue, we free ourselves from the limiting beliefs that hold us back and open the door to greater self-acceptance and personal growth. While the inner critic may never fully go away, we can learn to quiet its voice and replace it with one that encourages us to embrace our imperfections, take risks, and pursue our goals with confidence and resilience. Through this ongoing practice, we can create a more positive and empowering relationship with ourselves, one that allows us to thrive in all areas of life. Silencing the inner critic is an ongoing process that requires daily effort and practice. One of the most effective ways to quiet this negative voice is by cultivating self-awareness. The inner critic often operates on autopilot, feeding us negative thoughts without our conscious awareness. By developing mindfulness, we can learn to recognize these critical thoughts as soon as they arise. Mindfulness allows us to observe our inner dialogue without becoming overwhelmed by it. Instead of immediately believing the harsh judgments of the inner critic, we create space to question them. This space is crucial because it gives us the opportunity to pause, reflect, and choose a different response. Once we become aware of the inner critic's voice, the next step is to challenge its authority. The inner critic thrives on black and white thinking, catastrophizing situations, or making sweeping generalizations about our worth based on isolated incidents. For example, if we make a mistake at work, the inner critic might say, "You're incompetent," or "You always mess up." These statements are rarely true, but in moments of vulnerability or stress, they can feel convincing. Challenging the inner critic means questioning these exaggerated or irrational thoughts. By asking ourselves for evidence, is it really true that I always mess up, or what other times have I succeeded at this task? We begin to dismantle the critic's power over us. This process of cognitive restructuring helps to replace negative thought patterns with more balanced, realistic perspectives. One of the most powerful antidotes to the inner critic is self-compassion. Self-compassion involves treating ourselves with the same kindness, care, and understanding that we would offer to a close friend. When the inner critic is loud, it's easy to fall into the trap of self-punishment, believing that we deserve harsh treatment for our perceived failures. However, self-compassion reminds us that we are human, and that making mistakes or experiencing setbacks is part of the human condition. Instead of berating ourselves for our imperfections, we can acknowledge them with compassion and gentleness. This shift in attitude helps to quiet the inner critic by showing us that we do not need to be perfect to be worthy of love and acceptance. Self-compassion can be practiced in several ways. One simple but effective method is through self-compassionate self-talk. When the inner critic says, "You're not good enough," we can respond with a compassionate statement, such as, "I am doing my best, and that's all I can ask of myself." If the inner critic insists that we will fail, we can counter with, "It's okay to be afraid, but I am capable of handling challenges." Over time, these compassionate responses become more natural, and the critical voice loses its grip. By consistently practicing self-compassion, we create a new internal dialogue, one that is supportive, encouraging, and aligned with our well-being. In addition to self-compassion, it's important to practice gratitude as a way to combat the inner critic. The critical voice often focuses on what we lack or what we've done wrong, rather than acknowledging our strengths and accomplishments. Gratitude helps to shift our attention to what is going well in our lives. By regularly reflecting on the things we are grateful for, whether it's our health, relationships, or personal achievements, we remind ourselves of our inherent worth and the positive aspects of our lives. Gratitude doesn't ignore challenges or mistakes, but it provides balance by helping us see the bigger picture. This broader perspective makes it harder for the inner critic to dominate our thoughts. Another key practice in silencing the inner critic is learning to accept imperfection. The inner critic often holds us to impossible standards of perfection, making it difficult to feel satisfied with our efforts. This perfectionism creates a cycle of self-criticism, where we are constantly striving to meet unrealistic expectations and then berating ourselves when we inevitably fall short. Breaking free from this cycle requires embracing the idea that perfection is not only unattainable but also unnecessary. We can strive for excellence without needing to be perfect. Accepting our imperfections allows us to approach life with greater ease and self-acceptance, reducing the inner critic's power. In addition to self-compassion and gratitude, it's helpful to cultivate a sense of humor when dealing with the inner critic. The inner critic can be relentless in its negativity, but sometimes the best way to disarm it is by not taking it too seriously. When we learn to laugh at the absurdity of the inner critic's exaggerated claims, such as, "You're a total failure because you forgot to send one email," we take away its power. Humor allows us to see the inner critic for what it is, a voice rooted in fear, insecurity, and unrealistic expectations. By laughing at its ridiculousness, we diminish its influence over our self-perception. Surrounding ourselves with supportive people is another crucial factor in silencing the inner critic. The people we spend time with have a significant impact on how we see ourselves. If we are surrounded by critical, negative, or judgmental individuals, it can reinforce the messages of our inner critic. Conversely, when we are around people who are encouraging, compassionate, and non-judgmental, we are more likely to develop a positive self-image. These supportive relationships serve as mirrors, reflecting back our worth and potential even when we struggle to see it ourselves. Spending time with people who uplift us can help to drown out the voice of the inner critic, replacing it with affirming and validating messages. It's also important to engage in activities that foster a sense of flow and self-expression. The inner critic tends to be most active when we are focused on outcomes, whether it's achieving a goal, meeting a deadline, or gaining approval from others. When we engage in activities that allow us to lose track of time and become fully absorbed in the present moment, such as creative pursuits, physical exercise, or meditation, we quiet the mind's chatter, including the inner critic. These flow activities provide a break from the constant self-evaluation and judgment that fuels the critic's voice. They also remind us of the joy that comes from simply being, rather than constantly striving. In addition to cultivating flow, it's important to recognize that the inner critic often thrives in environments of comparison. Social media and other forms of media frequently promote unrealistic standards of success, beauty, and happiness. When we compare ourselves to the curated lives of others, it can fuel the inner critic's narrative that we are not measuring up. To combat this, we can limit our exposure to media that triggers feelings of inadequacy and instead focus on our own unique journey. By reminding ourselves that everyone's path is different and that comparison is often misleading, we create more space for self-acceptance and self-compassion. In moments when the inner critic feels particularly loud, it can be helpful to engage in grounding techniques to bring ourselves back to the present moment. The inner critic often draws us into a cycle of rumination, where we replay past mistakes or worry about future failures. Grounding exercises, such as deep breathing, progressive muscle relaxation, or mindfulness meditation, help to break this cycle by bringing our attention back to the present. When we are fully present, the inner critic loses some of its power because it relies on dwelling in the past or fretting about the future. Grounding helps us to reconnect with the here and now, where we can take constructive action rather than being paralyzed by self-criticism. Finally, it's important to practice patience and persistence when working to silence the inner critic. Changing deeply ingrained thought patterns takes time, and there will inevitably be setbacks along the way. The inner critic has often been a part of our internal dialogue for years, if not decades, and it won't disappear overnight. However, with consistent effort, self-awareness, and compassion, we can gradually reduce its influence. The key is to stay committed to the process and to treat ourselves with kindness, even when the inner critic resurfaces. Every time we challenge its voice or respond with self-compassion, we weaken its hold on us and create space for more empowering and supportive thoughts to take root. Silencing the inner critic is an ongoing process that requires daily effort and practice. One of the most effective ways to quiet this negative voice is by cultivating self-awareness. The inner critic often operates on autopilot, feeding us negative thoughts without our conscious awareness. By developing mindfulness, we can learn to recognize these critical thoughts as soon as they arise. Mindfulness allows us to observe our inner dialogue without becoming overwhelmed by it. Instead of immediately believing the harsh judgments of the inner critic, we create space to question them. This space is crucial because it gives us the opportunity to pause, reflect, and choose a different response. Once we become aware of the inner critic's voice, the next step is to challenge its authority. The inner critic thrives on black and white thinking, catastrophizing situations, or making sweeping generalizations about our worth based on isolated incidents. For example, if we make a mistake at work, the inner critic might say, "You're incompetent," or "You always mess up." These statements are rarely true, but in moments of vulnerability or stress, they can feel convincing. Challenging the inner critic means questioning these exaggerated or irrational thoughts. By asking ourselves for evidence, is it really true that I always mess up, or what other times have I succeeded at this task? We begin to dismantle the critic's power over us. This process of cognitive restructuring helps to replace negative thought patterns with more balanced, realistic perspectives. One of the most powerful antidotes to the inner critic is self-compassion. Self-compassion involves treating ourselves with the same kindness, care, and understanding that we would offer to a close friend. When the inner critic is loud, it's easy to fall into the trap of self-punishment, believing that we deserve harsh treatment for our perceived failures. However, self-compassion reminds us that we are human, and that making mistakes or experiencing setbacks is part of the human condition. Instead of berating ourselves for our imperfections, we can acknowledge them with compassion and gentleness. This shift in attitude helps to quiet the inner critic by showing us that we do not need to be perfect to be worthy of love and acceptance. Self-compassion can be practiced in several ways. One simple but effective method is through self-compassionate self-talk. When the inner critic says, "You're not good enough," we can respond with a compassionate statement, such as, "I am doing my best, and that's all I can ask of myself." If the inner critic insists that we will fail, we can counter with, "It's okay to be afraid, but I am capable of handling challenges." Over time, these compassionate responses become more natural, and the critical voice loses its grip. By consistently practicing self-compassion, we create a new internal dialogue, one that is supportive, encouraging, and aligned with our well-being. Silencing the inner critic is a profound challenge that many individuals face in their daily lives. The inner critic, often fueled by self-doubt and negative self-talk, can undermine one's confidence, erode self-esteem, and hinder personal growth. In the realm of Stoicism, addressing the inner critic involves cultivating self-awareness, practicing self-compassion, and aligning one's thoughts with reason and virtue. At the core of silencing the inner critic lies the practice of self-awareness. Stoicism teaches individuals to observe their thoughts and emotions without judgment, allowing them to recognize when the inner critic surfaces and begins to sow seeds of doubt and negativity. By developing a keen awareness of the inner dialogue, individuals can distance themselves from the critical voice and choose not to engage with its destructive narratives. Furthermore, Stoicism emphasizes the importance of practicing self-compassion as a means of counteracting the inner critic's harsh judgments. By approaching oneself with kindness, understanding, and forgiveness, individuals can cultivate a sense of inner peace and acceptance. This practice of self-compassion allows individuals to challenge the inner critic's negative narratives with self-affirming and positive beliefs, fostering a mindset of self-love and validation. Moreover, Stoicism encourages individuals to align their thoughts and beliefs with reason and virtue. By examining the validity of the inner critic's messages through the lens of Stoic principles, individuals can discern between helpful self-criticism that promotes growth and destructive self-sabotage that hinders progress. Stoics advocate for replacing negative self-talk with rational and virtuous thoughts that reflect one's true worth and potential. In essence, silencing the inner critic through the wisdom of Stoicism involves cultivating self-awareness, practicing self-compassion, and aligning one's thoughts with reason and virtue. By embracing these Stoic practices, individuals can quiet the voice of self-doubt, nurture a mindset of self-acceptance and empowerment, and pave the way for personal growth, resilience, and inner peace.